In a recent episode of The Briefing, the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, Albert Mohler Jr., had this to say about the influence of celebrity over people's politics.
The author of a recent book on celebrities and politics said of Kardashian, quote, her appeal and all of her millions of social media followers are non-transferable to voters who don't see this, and perception is reality in their minds. Quote, she may get a lot of likes and clicks, but it doesn't seem to translate into votes, end quote. Well, that's interesting just in and of itself, but I think it's more interesting when you put it in the historical context in which America was actually operating in very different terms a generation or two ago. Celebrity influence had a lot more power a generation or two ago. The endorsement by some prominent celebrities can make a big difference in the politics of the past. So what's changed? Is it just an eclipse in the power of celebrity? I don't think so. I might be tempted to want to think so, but I don't think so. No, I think the bigger issue is that the issues are far too basic right now for anyone much to care about what celebrities think.
And I'm bringing this up in this somewhat impromptu or quickly produced episode of the Redacted Culture Cast to talk about what I believe and what is called the end of the secular age. And in order to do this, I need to start with a little bit of a story, and that would be a short phrase. When I was a young man in college, I remember at that time there was this fervor against postmodernism in the environment which I was working and writing. And at that time, I had a professor who I was talking to about the philosophy and theology of one Karl Marx. And Marxism has no shortage of ire thrown at its way. The ideology that has become Marxist, or is Marxism in our worldview, the very true or the very sense of it as a religion, has caused catastrophic damage to many societies, peoples, cultures, ideologies, belief systems, and so forth. It is, in a sense, oftentimes described as a virus. It describes itself as a virus, something that goes around infecting host environments, be they colleges, universities, institutions, governments, or even families. But this discussion, this conversation came out as I was becoming more familiar with it on a technical level, and I was reading the book, or we were reading the book, the very easy one to read, the one that Marx always talks about. This is where I have to have a brain dump on exactly the subject that I'm supposed to talk about. The Communist Manifesto, and I was talking about the ideas presented in, or I was reading the ideas presented in the Communist Manifesto as what we should or ought do, or as if the authors of that book were making an argument about what we should or ought do. And the professor I was studying under, who I still hold a relationship with to this day, made a very clear statement. He said, you are reading it in a should or ought, and he is writing it in what will inevitably happen, what is or will come to pass. And so this mentality, this divide, this split in how separation, two ways of thinking, is how I want to illustrate today's episode on the end of the secular age. While I thought that Karl Marx was writing about the so-called Marxist or communist revolution as something that ought happen, my professor was correcting me and saying, no, he is arguing it about what will happen. And that is the same context that I am trying to refer to in this episode on the end of the secular age. Now, before we get any further in this, you might ask, well, what does the sponsorship have to do with the episode? And today's sponsor is Obsidian Arms. Obsidian Arms is one of those companies that represents and understands the multiple facets of gun culture. You may have heard me say this before, and I want to illustrate that in why they have come to support us, or being thankful for their support. But let's get into what they can do for you. Not only if you look at their components, which the one being a firing pin has got a unique attribute that you might want to check out on their website, you can go check that out at Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. But they also provide the ability for you to take make your ideas, your products, your next invention for the firearms industry or others, actually, anything that has to do with the well-being and utility of man's life, and you can bring that to them, and they are capable of moving it. They are oftentimes capable of making it, taking your idea, your drawing, your sketch, and helping you through the steps to turn it into something that you can bring to market. In addition to that, they sell a series of toolkits and punches and sets that belong on your workbench, whether you're a professional or a someone who works in the garage of your own accord. So if you would want to support this show, first and foremost, don't forget Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. So back to now. So now that we have brought that up, let's move on to the show. The secular age is a subject that I have brought up a number of times, but it is if you're going to read about it and you want to go the long, thorough route, read The Secular Age by Charles Taylor. But if you want to read an abbreviated version of it, one that I highly recommend, there's this book called How Not to Be Secular by James K.A. Smith, which helps reduce the 900-ish plus pages of Charles Taylor into a book that you can read in a week. And so the important beginning of this subject identifies that the secular age isn't something as simple as an age of non-belief, but rather that the term secularism or secular theory in this environment has shifted what it means to be secular. And so oftentimes in a very simplified form, we see secularism or being secular as the opposite of being religious, that you have religion on one hand and to be secular on the other. But if you were to look at it that way, you would be in disagreement with Charles Taylor. He presents three different definitions or way that secular might be used, but the one that is used to define the secular age, what it has meant to be secular in the last, say, 100 years, is that secularism is the idea that religion is just one option amongst many. That you can be Christian, I can be Muslim, and he can be atheist, but so long as we all sort of get along in this multicultural-ish idea, then we are fine. It's not necessarily an ought, but it's more of an is. That belief is much closer to a fashion statement, or belief and faith in this sense is very quickly reduced to a fashion statement, and that comes with its consequences. Now, I am arguing, and I believe that we are at the end of the secular age, because what we are witnessing in our world right now is an escalation towards new and resurgent religious ideology or belief systems. In other words, the suicide that is the production of the secular age has driven mankind who have left that environment to seek some sense of meaning. Now, think of it this way. In the secular age, and what we were referring to as the secular age, the core idea is that belief is just one option amongst many, and it effectively reduces any form of faith or conviction to that of a fashion statement. And where else have we seen this in American society or the West in general than the endless virtue signaling of brands and celebrities and individuals of such rapport? And yet, at the same time, the individuals that we see in our world, the people that we live amongst, and also the people that we observe on the silver screen, so to say, struggle with things like suicide or a meaningless life or the existential crisis. So the problem that we've run into is not so much that it is simply a contrast between the old traditional world with its simpler life but deep-seated meaning and our new modern bustling metropolis complete with its blatant disregard for the value of human life. Rather, what we're realizing, or what I believe has taken place, is that the secular age has essentially expended itself. It has run its course. In the same way that I was corrected by my professor to understand that Marx might be arguing what is going to happen versus what should happen, I think that this is exactly what's going on with the secular age. We might argue that people ought to become more religious or that they should seek after faith. We might be arguing that people should seek after the old ways and pursue what is right and true and good. But what I also want to argue and make sure is illustrated in this episode is that even if we look at the grand scale of the West, that is exactly what is happening. Take a look at the blasphemy laws, as Tim Pool likes to talk about, in regards to the pride flag being painted on the road. First, your public transit, which you supposedly pay your tax dollars for. I mean, this is a libertarian's nightmare / dream, is that your tax dollars are being used to paint the town and what is it? How would you call it? Signal allegiance to a religion by forcing people in your society, in your community, to conform to that belief. The very people who are accusing Christians or even Christian nationalists of wanting to enforce their belief system on others are they themselves using the pointy end of the state to enforce their worldview. Now, if before you go out and cry hypocrisy, maybe the reality that we are facing is this is just what it means to be mankind. But the issue that we're seeing here is, and what I'm trying to illustrate in this description, is that the identification or the religious defense, and I don't mean this and that the religious people are defending it, but that the way that the idea of the LGBTQ worldview is being defended on religious grounds. We are seeing that it is no longer good enough to be secular when it comes to the idea of LGBTQ. No, you must actually perform the rites. You must actually worship the thing. This ambiguous, self-licking ice cream cone that is that community. Now, I don't mean to even go out and directly attack individual members, but I want to illustrate on how what is happening is, and what I believe we are experiencing in our world, especially in the West, is that semi-neutral sort of libertine element that was the secular age is going away with its consequences forthwith. And that means that for us as individuals, we will no longer be able to enjoy I may call it enjoy, maybe it would be, we are no longer able to bask in the ambiguity of nothingness. It's probably too poetic for the point. What might be more specific or more appropriate to say is that in the secular age, during the time of the secular age, while it had its dire consequences with meaning and value and purpose, it also provided the West, the individuals who live in the West, with a blanket of security in ambiguity. You could just say, oh, well, I'm secular. That means I'm not affiliated to any responsibility, and which, when dissected, means that the individual is not held responsible to any account, even their own, which raises a pretty heavy question. Without responsibility, there is no meaning, but without any responsibility, you can't be held to account. And so perhaps what we're experiencing and we're observing is that the farce that you could remain neutral somehow, not in a objective third-party type mentality of epistemology and belief and so on and so forth, but in the example that a person could say, hey, I'm just an observer in my own community. You are just a voyeur in the debauchery that takes place. And so what we see in our lines, and the reason why I began with that argument or that statement by Albert Mohler, is that what he said, and what I can recall that he said, is that the issues that are at hand are just, quite frankly, more basic. They're so straightforward in front of us that the dependence on celebrity does not stick. And now that's probably not the best paraphrase of what his argument is, but it illustrates what I am still calling the end of the secular age. The moral problems that we are facing even now in this election cycle and now in our world are in a sense so basic, so in our face, that the need of reducing our worldview to the virtue signaling of a celebrity no longer is necessary. In fact, you might look at things like, where are the dividing lines in our culture? Where are the issues in America that cause people to lean one way or another? You could get really extreme in these descriptions, and for the sake of it, let's indulge in such extremity. You can either support that children should be able to, without their parents' knowledge or consent, participate in permanently altering activities in order to affirm their identity. In other words, gender surgery and hormone therapy without their parents' explicit consent. Or you can own a firearm and believe that you have some responsibility to its outcome. You can either support abortion or support the family unit. You are either pro fathers in the household. You are either against the nuclear family, or you support fathers being in the household. These are not really... you're going to obviously be able to see where my angle lies in these worldviews, but the point in those issues is that in some sense, and at least in this way, the moral issues that are at bay that divide the American population politically are so immediate that it's not just at their doorstep or on their kitchen table. It is on the forefront of our minds when we watch television or see movies or so on and so forth. Take the idea of what has happened in Star Wars lately. Even if the original stories, the original series, or if you even want to go back a little bit further, if you were to look at if you're going to look at the arc that is Star Wars, and I don't mean the stories and the canon within it, but look at how the different let's call it phases of Star Wars have described things like the Force, or painted the world as they go on. The original, as they were produced, the original or the first Star Wars trilogy was in its own sense a kind of Far East mysticism approach to the Force. You had the Force was this this unfathomable thing, this is sort of nirvana that controls, not nirvana, it's this thing in the universe. It was very mystical and magical in its own right. Hence, space wizards with laser swords. But the worldview and the presentation, this sort of assertion that the original trilogy of the Star Wars franchise, or the Star Wars IP presented, was in itself very much so a new age construction. If you were to even get nerdy about it, it was a soft magic system. There wasn't really a hard description of the mechanism of the Force. In fact, that was kind of the point. There was a vague spirituality to it, people meditating, but about what or to what or on what was kind of vague. And then there was a sort of light and darkness to it. So you had you could almost say that the theology of Star Wars as it was presented at that time was even Zoroastrian, with its good and evil, light and dark, there was this kind of duality to it, dualism to it, and yet it was still mystical in its application. But then you come to the prequel series, and the prequel series, which came out in the late 90s into the early 2000s, was at the sort of peak of new atheism. And so how was the Force described? Well, the Force was described as they had a pseudo-scientific approach to this midichlorians thing. And then you got to see what were the values of the time, some of the values of the time, or what were the desired values of the time. This sort of pseudo-scientific approach to everything was reflected in the the series called Star Wars. But now you look at it, and you look at the sequel series, which is the ones that were not exactly well represented, and it was identity was the core thing. Of course, you had this sort of ham-fisted inverse attempt at Anakin Skywalker with the Kylo Ren character, which was hard to deliver, and there was a little bit, it was almost like a reversion back to this form of mysticism. And of course, if you've been on the internet at all lately, especially in the Star Wars realm, this new series called The Acolyte has completely, again, changed what the Force is to fit the modern audience. Cue the critical drinker, and we'll have a laugh around. But the point in this description, this explanation, is not to make an argument, say, about Star Wars, but to be able to look at this IP, this kind of growing idea, this world, this universe of Star Wars, and look at the different times in which key elements were contributed to what is not really the canon, but the story, especially in media. And you can see how the worldview of the individuals who were behind it had an influence on what the Force turned out to be. And this same impact and effect can be seen in our culture. In the West, the liberty, that's not even the liberty, the convenience of being able to not take a side when it comes to vital moral questions is quickly fading, and you will be asked whether you are on the side of this moral group, or you pay allegiance to this moral group, or you virtue signal this moral group, and so long and so forth. Those things are religions. And in the worldview that I believe that we are in, if you were to ask what my worldview is, I believe that the end of the secular age will be solidified in the institution of a state religion, which will at times attempt to deny that it itself is a religion, and at times use the religious fervor of its own ideology to punish those who do not support it. Quite frankly, in short, if you use the language like allies or affirm, or if the language that we're seeing right now is, allies of the movement, I affirm your identity, you probably exist within the cult that is the state worship. And that is a dangerous and scary place to be. So if you desire to value human life, then consider what it means to be right, to do what is right and true and good. If you have an idea, an example of what the secular age looks like and its contrast in the post-secular age, go ahead and leave it in the comments below. And thank you for listening to this quick, short, and impromptu episode on the end of the secular age, which we certainly will talk about more in the future, because I believe it is important and inherent to what the future looks like, both inside gun culture and the West as a whole. That being the case, thank you for listening. If you want to support the show, you can head over to Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com, or you can head over to Redacted LLC, where you can find our store. And you can find out about upcoming events, including the public land cleanup that is going to take place in Utah over the weekend of July 6th, 2024. That being the case, this is us closing out. Now go forth and conquer.